Well, I think we are going to get started here now that everyone is joining. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Starrett. I'm a proud UBC alumna and a CBC reporter in Vancouver. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar entitled Growing Up in a Pandemic, Health and Resilience in Kids. This is the first webinar within the UBC Faculty of Medicine's Transforming Health for Everyone series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'd also like to acknowledge that if you're joining us today from many places near and far, to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands you are on. And I am here on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. These are challenging times, both with the COVID-19 pandemic and anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Asian racism continuing in communities around the world. I want to encourage everyone who's joining us today to join the UBC community in reflecting on what actions we can take individually and together in our institutions to promote an anti-racist analysis and actions in our daily lives. Well, on behalf of the UBC Faculty of Medicine, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today, whether you're viewing from BC, across Canada, or anywhere else in the world. We're pleased to be able to present this online webinar during the extraordinary time we're facing, and we're grateful to have you here today. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If anyone is experiencing any audio or video issues, please reach out via the GoToWebinar chat. That's the feature at the side of your screen for assistance. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the daily lives of our families everywhere, from changes in outdoor play and physical activity to screen time and use of technology. The way our children and teens spend their time looks much different than it did a year ago. These new experiences and environments, combined with the stress of an uncertain future, are affecting the brain health, the learning, and will continue to impact the generations of young people growing up under a pandemic. And parents and caregivers are essential to helping young people navigate change and build resilience, which of course supports physical and mental health and development. We're very lucky to be hearing from three experts from UBC, from the Faculty of Medicine, who will share with us their insights on how to guide the children and your teens and your families and communities to thrive in this very abnormal world we're living in the pandemic. Although they're not yet beside me on screen, I'd like to welcome them and thank them for their time. Shortly, I'll begin by introducing you to them as they tune in from their own locations. After after speaking to you, you'll have some time to answer questions or to give your questions for them to answer for you. Today we're using Slido. This is an online audience engagement platform for the Q&A session. You will have received instructions in the reminder email for this webinar, and some of you have already inputted questions. Thank you so much for that. A quick reminder though to put your questions into Slido. The questions go into slido.com. Use the event code, which is Healthy Kids, all lowercase, all one word, to sign in. You will see the instructions on your screen. You can input questions throughout the program. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, please begin your question with their name. All right, well, let's get started. I'm very excited about this conversation. Let's start with Dr. Lara Boyd. She's a neuroscientist and physical therapist in the Department of Physical Therapy. She's an expert in mapping how behaviors, environments, and experiences affect brain health and learning using technology such as magnetic resonance imaging and non-invasive brain stimulation. To date, this work has largely examined the impact of exercise and learning on neurobiology. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. And I'm excited to get to share some of our work and some of my thinking with you today. So I don't have a lot of time. I'm going to jump right to it. I have three things I want to tell you about today, three goals for this session. So firstly, I want to explain to you how we learn. So what changes in your brain when you learn something new? And by the way, what changes in your brain is the same as what changing in your kid's brain. We all learn the same. And so the good news here is everything I talk about today applies to your child, but also is going to apply to your brain as well. I then want to talk to you about what we understand are the effects of stress and anxiety on learning and on brain function. And then I want to finish with some findings from my research and others that suggest ways that we can mitigate the effects of stress and anxiety on brain function and also on learning. So let's get to it. So if I can go on to my next slide. So when you learn, you're actually changing your brain. You're changing it in several ways that I'll talk about in a second. But when you hear the word neuroplasticity, this is what we're referring to. So every time you learn something new, you reorganize your brain, you change it in multiple ways. And in fact, that's something that you're doing right now. So when you're learning, if we can go on to our next slide, there are three ways that you're changing the biology in your brain, the neurobiology of your brain. So learning is driving neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity to support learning involves changes in your brain chemistry, in your brain structure, your brain function. And then I just want to make sure that I say this before I forget, all those things are happening together and happening in concert with one another. So this beautiful picture I have on the screen is from some seminal work by Eric Kandel, and these are actually neurons in your brain. They're the basic cells within your brain, and they're very intricately connected, and they're able to change their connections the way they interact with each other to support learning. So let's go to the next slide and talk about changes in brain chemistry. So the first and the fastest thing that changes in your brain when you learn something new is changing in the chemical composition of your brain. So those neurons I showed you in the slide before, they actually don't physically touch one another. They come very, very close, and they communicate by secreting chemical compounds from one to another that then affect the excitability of individual neurons and also networks of neurons. So this can happen and change very rapidly. We think it's probably how we support short-term learning, and we can actually now map this in the human brain. So on the slide there in the lower right-hand corner, some data by my graduate student, Jennifer Ferris, and myself. We're actually mapping the changes in chemical spectra in the brain. This is in an individual with stroke, but showing that changes in cortical excitability are also related to changes in these chemical concentrations. Let's move on and talk about brain structure, because it's the second thing that changes. I'm showing you a picture here of all the connections in the brain. That's actually my brain. And it's very pretty, I think, but I don't think it's pretty just because it's my brain. I think all brains are pretty. And it's showing the connectivity of the brain up, down, side to side, and front to back. And so when we learn, we also can change brain structure by elaborating these connections and also by thickening and thinning different brain regions that are important. Now, changes in brain structure take a bit of time. And so this is probably more related to our long-term memory formation. And so the changes in brain chemistry and structure are interacting. We make a short-term memory supported by chemical change. Then we change our brain structure to enable those memories to be retrieved later on. And that's going to be something that takes a bit more time and probably also takes sleep, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a second. So the last thing that changes, if we can move forward, is brain function. And so how brain regions are interacting, turning on and off, and the intensity of that activity is also going to support learning, and it changes with learning. So as we learn, our brain function actually becomes more efficient. So we need less brain to support the same behavior. And so if you take those three things together, they're going to support learning. So if we can move forward in the slides, not only do all of these things interact, but what's very important about their interaction is the ability of the brain to change, whether it's chemistry, structure, or function, is supported by something in the brain that we call trophic factors. They're growth factors. And so the expression of these growth factors is very important for enabling these biological changes that support learning. Now, what's one of the tricks around these trophic factors and around what causes our brain to change is that it's highly driven by our experience. And so if we can move to the next slide, we find that the single largest driver of brain changes are experience. We don't have a drug that can do this for us. And trust me, it's not for the drug companies having not tried. They tried very hard to find drugs that support and will stimulate neuroplastic change. But it turns out that our environment, our experiences, what we're practicing, what we're interested in, are the very single largest driver of how our brain is shaped. And so that means that our brain change can be shaped very positively by learning. It also can be shaped negatively by things like addiction, chronic pain, and in this current environment we live in today, stress and anxiety. So let's move forward and let's talk about that second part, which is what is stress doing in our brain? So when we're very stressed, our body releases a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol actually is a hormone that can be incredibly useful. So if we can move forward, I'll tell you a little bit about why we have cortisol. Next slide, please. So cortisol is secreted, oops, go back one. Sorry, I'm driving my own slides. So the hormone cortisol is secreted by our adrenal glands, and it's a really important hormone in our body. So it allows us to do things like metabolize sugar, regulate our blood pressure. It allows us to be aroused. It helps us wake up in the morning. And just a little bit of cortisol, you know, that kind of little tiny bit of anxiety you might have before you take an exam or you give an important talk to a lot of people on the internet, it can actually positively boost your memory and your immunity and your pain sensitivity. So if we can move forward in the slides. There's a downside to cortisol though. If you have long and persistent exposure to stress, long and persistent exposure to cortisol, you can see some side effects that aren't so good. So you can have impaired cognitive performance. It can change the way we metabolize blood sugar. It can change our bone density, change our immunity, and it also can affect our cholesterol, so it can lead to heart disease. So we know that cortisol is kind of this good news, bad news story, but we know that long and persistent exposure to cortisol is not healthy. So if we can move forward in the slides. So what we're hoping for is just the right amount of cortisol. So if you have too little, you're lowly aroused, you can't wake up in the morning, and if you have too much, you're really anxious, and it actually will lead to memory impairments. So we can move forward. So one of the things, next slide please. One of the things about cortisol when it's persistent is it actually competes with and can block the expression of these growth factors in the brain. So remember I mentioned when we're learning, we have these trophic factors in our brain that are enabling brain chemistry, structure, and function to change to support our new knowledge. So it turns out when we have high and persistent cortisol, it competes with one of the key trophic factors. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We call it BDNF. And we know from a lot of experiments, such as the one that I'm showing here, that when cortisol is high, brain-derived neurotrophic factor is low. And so that means that we're going to have a lot of trouble learning and changing our brain in positive ways when our cortisol is really, really high. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we know is really important around cortisol is that it can interfere with our sleeping. So sleep is a very important modifier of cortisol and of stress. So for example, if you slept 8 hours last night versus having only slept 6, your cortisol will be 50% lower in your bloodstream if you slept more, if you slept 8 hours as an adult. And so we know that cortisol is interacting with melatonin, which helps us go to sleep in the body in kind of a regular fashion. So when we have light to our eyes, we express cortisol, and the expression of melatonin, which makes us sleepy, is actually blocked. When light goes away, we get sleepy because now melatonin is being released and it outcompetes cortisol and allows us to relax and go to sleep. And as it becomes light again in the morning, cortisol is expressed and we wake up and we go about our daily lives. And so we know that just by trying to make changes to our sleep cycle, we can significantly and positively affect cortisol in the body. So next slide. So I put this up really quickly, and you can find it yourself. It's at the National Sleep Foundation. But if you look at this slide, we actually need, most of us, a lot more sleep than we're able to get. So I have 2 14-year-olds in my house, twin daughters, and they should be sleeping 8 to 10 hours a night. And that's a bit of a challenge for us to get that done. Even adults, even though we like to pretend we don't need much sleep, most of us honestly need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night in order to manage our cortisol and actually not start to move into a state of sleep deprivation, so also to optimize learning. Next slide, please. So another thing we know that will modify cortisol in our bodies are mindful types of practices, and we're not entirely sure why. There's quite a bit of research in this area. But my colleague at UBC, Kim Schoenert-Reichel, has shown that engaging in just 9 minutes of mindfulness practice a day in children will improve their empathy, make them more optimistic, and lower their levels of cortisol. We have research from my group that we did on people who engage in just routine yoga in the community. They're not, crazy yogi practitioners. They just go 2 to 3 times a week. And we showed that they also had adaptive levels of cortisol and were better able to mitigate stress when we induced it into them in a laboratory situation. Next slide, please. And then really one of the best and most effective ways to manage stress and cortisol is exercise. So exercise is very interesting. It increases cortisol in the short term, but cortisol then will rebound to lower levels once you start to recover from that exercise bout. And so it's a very, very adaptive way to try to manage your cortisol. It also helps improve sleep. So you may be tuning into a cycle there of trying to manage your stress in a more effective way. And it doesn't seem to matter how you get that exercise, whether it's running, biking, walking, gardening. There's many ways to affect this, but it does seem to be incredibly positive. So next slide, and I think this is my last one. So this is just a bit of a summary slide that kind of, I hope, will reinforce these ideas that neuroplasticity is highly driven by brain change, which is mitigated by this trophic factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And some of the things that will really help to facilitate the learning and those plastic changes in your brain are exercise, sleep. Nutrition is an important one that I didn't talk about today, but I want to acknowledge it. And then, of course, trying to mitigate and keep stress as low as we possibly can. I know that's a big ask right now in this environment, but there are some of these adaptive ways, and I hope I've given you some tools today that you can use in your own life and use with your family to try to help facilitate that and continue keeping our brains healthy and keeping our kids learning. So thank you very much, and I'll turn this back to Angela.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. And what an important conversation to be having during this time, at the pandemic times we're calling it. I've been reading so much about fear and how fear is stress, and we're all of us are in a huge state of fear right now. Fear of catching COVID, fear of death, keeping our family members safe. And I think what you were talking about, 9 minutes of mindfulness a day, practicing yoga, that's actually something I've started. I never did that before. Gardening, getting outside, exercise, these are all such important takeaways. And thank you so much. I think people are really needing to hear this stuff right now, and also how it affects our brain and the cortisol. That's something I've been researching a lot right now, and how and the memory loss. What an important conversation to have when we're talking about children and teens during the pandemic. So thank you so much for this, Laura. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back up to your Lara Boyd, neuroscientist and physical therapist in the Department of Physical Therapy. Thank you so much for that. We're going to head now to Dr. Shimi Kang, an award-winning medical doctor, researcher, and expert on the neuroscience of innovation, leadership, and motivation. She's a clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and has made promoting wellness a priority. Her latest book, The Tech Solution, provides neuroscience-based strategies to optimize technology's incredible benefits while minimizing its many drawbacks. Welcome, Shimi.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Dr. Boyd, for that wonderful presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you specifically about technology use in kids and what we know about the impact of the COVID pandemic on our behaviors. It's going to tie right into what Dr. Boyd just talked about in terms of neurochemicals, and really want to leave you with a practical paradigm that you can use immediately in your homes, classrooms, and workplaces. So let's get started with the first slide. So I really think, I opened my book with this idea that the fire of our time is technology. Back in our ancestors, cavemen, there was an innovation, it was called fire, and they had to decide how they were going to teach this to their children. If they didn't teach them and understand how to use fire appropriately, they would certainly be left behind. But if they didn't use it the right way, they could be burned and burn down the house. So I feel, next slide, that we're really in this time, the fire of our time is technology. If we can teach children healthy tech habits and using technology in the service of their health, their happiness, their success, motivation, and innovation, it will lead them to go further and farther than any generation before us. However, if we're not doing that, it could certainly lead to serious negative consequences to physical health, mental health, social health. So to me, I really want to lay this foundation that this is one of the top topics for us before the pandemic. We know teenagers were checking their phone 150 times a day. The average young person was online 7 hours. That's after homework and school. So let's see what happened in the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in general, we know that there are a lot of concerning trends that we've seen so far. Data is early, but 81% of the nonprofits that monitor cyberbullying has said that their calls and questions and stats have gone up. We're seeing, as Angela mentioned in the introduction, we're seeing an increase in racism and hate online, targeting LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous and Asian individuals around the world. And we're definitely seeing increase in video gaming up to 75%. Of course, gaming addiction became a medical diagnosis several years ago, according to the WHO. And my prediction is we will definitely see it as well in the DSM, which is our psychiatry manual. Internet addiction disorder is also a medical diagnosis. So next slide, please. So what do we do about all this? I think first, knowledge is power, and we have to understand what tech use is linked to. And really kind of think about what it is that we're trying to work on or improve. We know that there's links to anxiety, depression, body image disturbance. We're seeing increase in perfectionism, particularly among young girls. Of course, gender is not binary, but we're seeing gender trends there. I mentioned addiction. We're seeing rising rates of loneliness. In fact, when the iPhone reached 50% saturation in American households, the rates of loneliness went way up among teenagers. We're seeing reduced empathy, social skills, the ability to look at people, talk to people in person. Of course, sleep disorder, eyesight disorders, and issues of posture and sedentary lifestyle. Next slide, please. So in order to manage all this, before we used to talk about screen time, and I think, we all knew that was pretty tough even before the pandemic. Now it's even harder to count minutes and hours. What we really need to do is go further in our understanding of what technology is doing. And like Dr. Boyd mentioned, our brain and our health depends on our experiences. So in my book, I lay out a metaphor of understanding technology consumption like food consumption, and it impacts our minds the way food impacts our bodies. And we have to understand the ingredients of our tech diet. So next slide, please. So if you look closely, this is a general overview of what a tech diet can look like. And as parents and educators, we know how to teach diet. We know we have to do it early. We know we have to do it repetitively. We know that it's a never-ending discussion. So unfortunately, but fortunately, we can use the same metaphor and paradigm for technology use. We can teach our children there's healthy tech. That is tech that leads to self-care, to creativity, and to meaningful social connection. Consume that, make that choice. There's the junk tech, like a bag of chips. It's mindless scrolling, it's zoning out, there's empty calories. A little bit of junk tech is okay, just like junk food, pizza and chips on a Friday night, but too much is going to harm us. And there's the toxic tech we want to avoid. The hate, the bullying. We want to avoid the FOMO and the comparisons. That's the fear of missing out, particularly that young adolescent brain is so sensitive to inclusion and social connection and peer admiration. So really guiding our children to say, look, if you're going to be on social media, I don't want you comparing your life to others, that fake filtered life. We have to role model it ourselves. So let's go through the ingredients. Next slide. The first ingredients of the tech diet I mentioned, there is dopamine. That's our sugar, okay? That's our junk tech. We need some sugar, but we don't need piles of it. We don't let our kids wake up and eat a bag of candies, nor should we let them wake up and scroll through YouTube kind of nonsense videos or mindless scrolling, and we do that ourselves. So dopamine is the neurochemical of short-term pleasure. It's our neurochemical of reward. I'm an addiction psychiatrist at Children's Hospital. I was there 17 years, started the addiction program, and really have to understand that these little bursts of pleasure have a purpose, an evolutionary purpose for us. hunting, competing, gathering, collecting likes in social media, leveling up in a video game. But we have to remember that that doesn't translate to long-term health. That's a short-term reward, and it can be addictive. So next slide. We want to avoid the junk tech. And I mentioned junk tech can come from all forms, whether it is sitting for long periods of time, the posture associated with the sleep deprivation, and the behaviors. But just a reminder, you saw Dr. Boyd's slide, that really we cannot learn, we cannot grow, we cannot recover or repair unless we are outside of that survival stress system. In order for learning to happen, we really need to be in that state of relaxation. So regardless of what the tech is, if it's stressful, whether it's through sleep deprivation, sitting for long periods of time, or multitasking, which actually is quite stressful on us, now that's that ingredient of cortisol. Okay, next slide. What we want to consume is healthy tech, and I kind of divided it up simplistically into the neurochemicals that our body will release when we are experiencing certain activities. When we engage in self-care, mindfulness, sleep, listening to our favorite playlist while we're having a bubble bath, whatever it is, tech can help us release endorphin. I meditate every morning. I do gratitude journaling on my phone. Tech can help me release that endorphin, that really important neurochemical. Tech can help us release oxytocin. That's our neurochemical neurohormone of bonding, trust, and love. So meaningful connection, using video conferencing when we can, seeing each other's faces, hearing each other's voices, so important to our connection. And tech can be used to help us with serotonin, which we get from improving our confidence and mastery, whether it's learning through creativity, coding, making art, photography. There's so much wonderful innovation online. Next slide, please. So when we do this, as you heard, now we can wire and fire our tech habits with positive tech, and we do need to do this early as possible. The brain has neuroplasticity, you heard that, and the young brain is more neuroplastic. So if we can build these healthy tech habits from an early age, now we have a highway. They're already there to help later in life, so we're not using tech for negative coping skills, distraction, and all the kind of negative aspects we're seeing there. I do have to say that tech is designed with this idea of persuasive design, purposeful manipulation of our dopamine, very primal motivations to attract and hook us, particularly young people are prone to that. So developing healthy habits early, and luckily we can always reset our habits. We just got to kind of create a new trail in our brain, in the forest of our brain, are the neurons, as you can see in that photo. Next slide, please. So really, in summary, my message is to let's go deeper in our understanding of technology use. Let's go beyond screen time to screen quality. Let's use the metaphor that is familiar to us, that we already know how to teach kids. Let's use a diet, a nutritional metaphor, guide our children to consume healthy tech, limit and avoid that junk food tech, that mindless tech, and avoid the toxic tech. And when we do that repetitively, frequently, at the dinner table, role model it just like we have to do with our nutrition, now we can have a sustainable paradigm for having this conversation about such an important topic that's facing us all. Next slide, please. So if we do that, I feel really the next step in our human evolution, if we go back to our caveman slide and hunter-gatherer, is a ability to be an individual that is using tech for our well-being, for our health, our happiness, our innovation, as opposed to tech using us for that attention economy, that persuasive design. We're heading there. We're seeing tech companies that have increased sense of social consciousness. We're seeing movements. We had a honeymoon in a sense, or a period where we thought tech was all positive promise, and then now we have research that there are negative drawbacks. Let's guide our children so that we can take that next step in our human evolution, because we know that tech is a important and powerful part of our lives. Next slide. So I just want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that, Shimi. And what a good connection to Lara Boyd's presentation about the harm that stress can have on the cortisol and on our body. I loved what you had to say about relating technology to the fire of our time. I mean, everyone who has a kid can relate right now. Like technology is, you just can't avoid it. I can't even imagine not using any technology. So what a way to bring in how to balance healthy ways to use tech, how our healthy tech habits can build our resiliency and positive coping skills. So thank you so much for that. And for a reminder for everyone tuning in, please make sure to add your questions on Slido as we go along for Shimi, for Lara Boyd. And we were just speaking to Shimi Kang, a clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And right now we are on to our final speaker, a double UBC alumna. Mariana Brussoni is an investigator with the British Columbia Children's Hospital Research Institute and an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics and the School of Population and Public Health. Mariana conducts research on children's risky play and adult attitudes related to children's risk-taking and safety. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be among this panel and to be joining you from the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations traditional territories. So next slide, sorry. What I wanted to talk to you about today is really looking at building health and resilience, particularly through outdoor play, and talking about the what, why, and the how of outdoor play, specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. So next slide. And I find some of the best ways really to do this and for us to relate to the importance of this is to think back to our own favorite childhood play memory. So I just want you to think about that for a moment and really take yourself back to what you were doing and where you were and who you were with and the kinds of things that you were experiencing and feeling. And I'd love to hear all of your stories. And I've heard many stories over the course of my research, but unfortunately with this current panel, I'm gonna have to take a guess that you were most likely outside, that you were probably, if you go back, please, probably in the streets around your home, or in forest, ditches, ravines, so not necessarily formal playgrounds, that you were unsupervised and just out playing with your friends. So if you go to the next slide, so why is it that this kind of play is so important? Well, what we find is that outdoor play offers things that aren't available in indoor play. And in fact, that these experiences end up being quite critical for children's health, development, and well-being. So for example, people, when they think back to their favorite play memory and why it was so important to them, and when we ask children about their favorite play experiences, they talk about a sense of joy and fun and being able to do what they want and how they want to do it, meeting up with their friends, and this sense of kind of limitless time to play and being able to shout and just move their bodies in ways that they can't indoors and finding new and different opportunities for play in a constantly changing outdoor environment. So if we go to the next slide, it turns out that these characteristics are actually quite important when you think about children's health and development. So for example, being out playing with their friends and figuring out how they're going to play and what the rules of the game are and how to get everybody involved, that's really important for socio-emotional development and emotion regulation. Figuring out what their goals are and how they're going to attain those goals and the steps and keeping their attention on those goals, critical for cognitive development, moving their bodies in different ways than they can indoors and developing that physical literacy, really important for their physical development. And then we know as well that having those opportunities for being able to figure out for themselves what they're capable of, what their body's capable of, the kinds of risks they can take and manage, succeeding and failing, really important for their mental health and well-being. And finally, we also know that kids are more physically active outdoors than they are indoors. And in particular, in fact, when they're allowed to play in ways that they want to play and unsupervised even, that they're even more physically active. So next slide. So it really isn't an overstatement to say that play is the engine of optimal child development. So next slide. So what about COVID-19? Well, I was privileged enough to work with a national group of researchers, and we did a national survey with parents across the country looking at 24-hour movement behaviors and outdoor play of kids during the lockdown period of the COVID-19 pandemic. So about mid-April is when this survey was run. So the 24-hour movement behaviors would be things like sleep, sedentary behavior, screen time, physical activity, and also outdoor play. So if you go to the next slide. So essentially what we found is all sorts of things that weren't that positive. So next slide. The summary of our findings really is that we had only 2.6% of children and youth during that period were meeting the 24-hour movement guidelines. Now, normally Canadian kids don't actually do that well. They're about a 13 to 15%. And so that is abysmal at the best of times. But even during COVID, it really was quite awful. And what we found was that kids were sleeping more, which was positive, but they were definitely more sedentary and on their devices, as many of us can attest to, certainly in my house with my two kids, and that there was less physical activity and certainly less outdoor play. So next slide. So in terms of kind of outdoor play and the importance for physical activity, it really relates quite well to the COVID-19 pandemic. But in addition, the importance of outdoor play during COVID-19 is important for building immunity. So for example, we know and we heard from the previous speakers the importance of physical activity and cortisol, but also in building kind of our body's general immunity, exposure to vitamin D through sunlight, and feelings of mental health that come with being outdoors and physically active. And I think we heard this quite clearly in Dr. Boyd's presentation. Furthermore, COVID is less likely to be transmitted outside. So it's really a wonderful venue for us to be focusing our attention on. And play in and of itself is quite critical for kids to be able to work through their stress and anxiety. And so it's important to be able to provide those opportunities for kids, even more so now that we're dealing with the stressors of COVID. So next slide. So how do we do this? Well, there's three key ingredients to outdoor play supportive environments. The first being time. So making sure that kids have time every day to be able to go out and play. Space, so making sure that they have spaces that are free of serious hazard, that they can feel safe to be able to wander and do what they want and that are stimulating. And some of the best ways to do this is actually to provide loose parts, things like sticks, stones, mud, crates, tarps, those sorts of things that they can move around and allow their imagination to shape the play. And the third ingredient being freedom, to be able to allow the play that they want to play. And so that adults aren't there stopping them or telling them what they can or can't do or how they should be playing. And we have tools that I'll share in a moment to help with these things. So next slide. So at this point, I really want each of you to think, one thing that you might do differently to support your own or other children's outdoor play, making sure to think about something that's attainable, that would be quite simple for you to do to start you thinking about this journey. And next slide. And I would point you to Outdoor Play Canada as an incredible resource for posted on the resource pages, all sorts of different tools for parents, for practitioners, educators, etc., around supporting outdoor play, including our own tool for parents to get them to stop being so afraid of their kids being able to, say, walk to school or take some risks through their play. So next slide. So I'll stop there. You can find my contact information here, and I look forward to the questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you so much also for bringing us back into thinking about our own childhood. And I don't know about other people, but for mine, I just find today everything's very intentional. Like you were saying, you have to plan, make sure it's safe. A lot of us don't have outdoor spaces anymore. And the time, we have such little time, I feel like now, whereas before, for me, I would just go out and walk. Probably really like for me, I would never do that with my son now, but everything does need to be so much more intentional. And I'm finding that with my son, like every day we have to go to a mountain or go to the beach or get outside in some way. And how interesting that that's so important for our immunity too. And I wasn't thinking about that, but that exercise and all the vitamins and being in that outdoor space. And thank you so much to you all. I loved how you all tied in with each other from the beginning. So we're going to move into the Q&A period now. Shimi and Lara, thank you so much for coming back on. It's lovely to have you back, and thank you so much for your powerhouse level of expertise. We've got a good number of questions on the Slido. A reminder to our audience as well to please continue to enter your questions via Slido at www.slido.com with the event code, which is all lowercase, all one word, Healthy Kids. Before we get to the audience questions, though, I just wanted to ask a couple of my own. I'm just going to ask you one person to take on one of the questions. I'm going to ask two. And to get started, I mean, one of the things all of you sort of the questions that were drawn out of that making me think, how would things have been different if COVID-19 had happened, 10 plus years ago when socialization and connection through technology wasn't readily available? Anybody who wants to take that on?
Well, I'm happy to, since tech is really on my mind these days. I think there would have been pros and cons, actually. I think we wouldn't have seen that rise in cyberbullying, the increase in video gaming as much, and the sedentary, the sleep deprivation, all of the downsides of tech. However, I must say, like, I don't know how as a world, I have 3 kids at home, and at one point there was all 5 of us online. And I was able to work, see patients, do my research. My kids were able to learn. We had to adapt, of course. So I'm very grateful for technology, and it's really important that we don't demonize tech, but we really look at it as a tool for our purpose. And thank goodness. And I think that as the COVID goes on, because we don't know how long, stay tuned for some really innovative technology platforms and processes and tools that will help us even further. I think that's what we want to demand from the industry, and then we want to choose wisely how we're using it.
Thank you so much. What a good point. And I've been thinking about that a lot too. Like, how can we make the Zoom calls better or different or have more options for us to communicate and participate? One of the questions I wanted to ask one of you, the greater our contacts, our social contacts, the greater the risk. When it comes to sports and other group activities for kids, how can we balance that physical and mental health benefits, of these activities with the risks of increased spread of COVID-19 within our families and communities?
So I can take that
I'm
on.
really happy to speak to that. I think it's a real challenge to balance the two, but I think we minimize our physical activity at our own peril. There are so many benefits to it. I don't see how we can possibly step back from it. I think, the data suggests if we're outdoors, that's certainly a huge plus, and even better if we're out in nature. And so I think we just need to be really, really smart about making sure that we continue to let our kids be engaged and playing, and also that we try to continue to get those neurobiological effects from exercise.
And Mariana, you wanted to jump in there. What were you keen to say?
Yeah, well, we know, for example, in terms of kind of the transmission of COVID, that there's some really important key behaviors like the hand washing and the physical distancing that are, the most important in terms of kind of avoiding transmission. But like Lara, Dr. Boyd, I would also stress the importance of being outside and physical activity. And we know that transmission is less likely outdoors. So it is quite possible for us to still see our friends and be engaged in those positive behaviors while implementing those really key public health measures like the physical distancing and the regular hand washing.
Thank you so much. Let's head to the Slido questions now. I think most people know how it works, that people can vote on the questions, and whatever has the highest number of likes gets bumped up to the top. So I'm just going to start with the one that has the most likes. Oh, it looks like someone unliked that. The question from someone who's wants to be anonymous says, you know, we are supposed to shrink our bubbles, but I want my kids to be engaged and social. I don't know about you guys, but when I go out, the parks are packed with sports activities, and I'm always like, is that okay? And this person is asking, do you think it's okay to put them in sports and extracurricular activities?
So I think to a certain extent, we talked about it with the previous question. I mean, certainly my research focuses on unstructured activities and the importance of that. You know, the sports have started up, extracurricular activities have started up, and they are being overseen with guidelines around keeping kids, you know, as safe as is possible in the circumstances. So I think that they are a viable option, and parents need to make their own decisions around what they're comfortable with, and their children around what they're comfortable with as well.
This is an interesting question, and I think, Laura, this ties in a lot to what you were talking about at the very beginning. The question again from someone anonymous is, what may be some long-term social and emotional effects of the pandemic era in young children? Let's skip down. Sorry, just bump down.
People change their mind.
Yeah, maybe they changed their mind, but I mean, I think that the gist of the question is, oh, I'm sorry, I've lost this completely. Well, let's move on to a different question. And I was kind of gearing that to you, Dr. Lara Boyd. What habits should we focus on most during this time to help with the development of our kids' brains?
Sure, and I can speak to the first one too, because it's something that, you know, I personally have worried about. I mean, are we going to be living with the after effects of this probably 2-year event once the time we're all said and done with it, through generations? And I think the answer in short is yes. I think that, you know, this chronic stress that we're all living under, it's affecting all of us, including our kids, and they're especially vulnerable because their brains are changing so very quickly. And so I think it's a good news, bad news story. It's something to be worried about. But as you've heard from all of us, there's a lot of things we can be doing in our daily lives and our behaviors and our habits to try to mitigate those changes, to help our kids be resilient and to maybe take on some really great stress management habits that I certainly didn't have when I was a teen. And that maybe we'll carry them forward in a really nice and healthy way. And so I think that maybe that's the way to turn it, is to take that concern and try to make it into a long-term benefit for our kids and how they shape their environments and their behaviors.
Yeah, Shimi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in, and I agree with that for sure. We do know, though, right now, in this moment in time, as a psychiatrist, I work closely with the school system and health system, and the calls to social services has actually gone down somewhere close to 300%. And that's actually concerning, because normally those calls are coming from teachers, public health nurses, concerned community coaches, citizens, who are there to, you know, who are safeguarding, helping those vulnerable children, those marginalized children. So I think we have to think about right here and now, how can we reach those kids that normally a system, a community system, would be able to find and report and swoop in. And that, I believe, is an immediate concern for children, whether it's abuse, neglect, stress, alcoholism. We know mental health issues affect 1 in 4 already people on the planet. Stress was the #1 health epidemic. We're seeing rising rates of loneliness. So I think that we really want to look at, and I say we need to flatten the mental health curve that we're currently in as well.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure we'll get into the mental health effects as we go. This is an interesting question. Somebody who is a little bit Pollyanna about the pandemic, and I'm curious about that too. We've heard about environmental effects and people reframing the way we think about life and even race and culture. This person, Lynette, is asking, how do we turn the experience of the pandemic into a positive effect on our kids' brains? Any one of you wanted to jump in on that?
Well, I could offer a small, maybe more of a personal observation. I don't have data for it. You know, one thing the pandemic has done in my family is we've been given a lot of time together, which I, as the mom, have really valued. I mean, my teen, I have 14-year-old daughters, so kind of they come and go on whether or not I'm the worst person in the world or relatively tolerable. And I say that tongue in cheek, you know, somewhat laughingly, but I have enjoyed the time with them because things have slowed down so very much, to be able to watch them do their schoolwork and engage. But I want to recognize, I say that from a place of immense privilege because I'm able to stay home and work and have a day that I structure really to accommodate my family's needs. And I want to acknowledge that's very difficult in many houses where people are still continuing to have to leave to do some of the essential care work in our community. So, you know, we get back to this, the pandemic really affecting different people in vastly different ways. Some doing all right and some really struggling.
This is an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure how it fits in with the pandemic, but this person, anonymous, person asking a question, asks, I am finding it hard to make sure my preteen has enough freedom right now, right, within the reality of the pandemic to build independence, but I feel it is so important at this age. Any advice?
This is my research area, so I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, we spend a lot of time looking at parents' fears around their kids' independence, and some of the things that we often find, like the big fears are, you know, fears of strangers and kidnapping, fears of their child getting hit by a car, and also surprisingly fear of what other parents will think of them, you know, for letting their kids outside or, you know, be independent and so on. So we actually have a tool for parents that you can find at outsideplay.ca, which we've tested in a randomized control trial that is actually meant to have you think reflectively around what's important to you in terms of what you want for your child, and think about how your own life is structured and some of the ways that you can make manageable changes that would start on this journey. And it could be very simple things, even like for example, for some parents, even not being able to say be careful, you know, when they see their child doing something. So count to 17 before saying be careful might be, you know, a way to even start you on this journey.
I was going to jump into, I have 3 kids and I have a tween and teenagers, so I'm right in the thick of it. And we know from parenting research, and I actually wrote, my first book was called The Dolphin Parent. I created this really easy, quick metaphor. You don't want to be a jellyfish, meaning you don't want to be permissive and not have rules structure. That often, you know, we know that there's high risk taking and that doesn't lead to those critical thinking skills and independence in the healthy way. But you also don't want to be authoritarian, whether that's a helicopter, shark, tiger, snowplow, whatever you want to call it. Then we see kids go underground. And really the parenting research shows this balanced place of authoritativeness. I call it the dolphin. It's firm but flexible. Think of the body of the animal. There's rules, expectations. You are the parent, but there's flexibility. You know, for my kids, there are 3 different human beings with different personality style, different ages, and you have to be adaptable and flexible. So I hope that little metaphor might help people.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I loved, Marianne, what you were saying about count to 17. And I just realized as you said that, like I say be careful, like probably 80 times a day, easily. So it's like, you're cooking, be careful. My child is doing a lot more cooking. I don't know about anybody else, but that's good for me. I have a question about mask wearing. And there's so many different threads to tug on there with the mask conversation. But this person is asking if one of you could speak about the social, emotional, developmental impact of mask wearing for different age groups.
Well, I do a little bit of research in early childhood education settings, and it's a challenge there in terms of the quite young kids because they also need to see other kids and other adults and how their expressions and moving their faces and forming words and those sorts of things. So there are big challenges there. But one of the things that certainly the research out of the BC Center for Disease Control and elsewhere is finding, fortunately, is that kids are less likely to get COVID-19. They're less likely to transmit it, and they're less likely to be seriously ill when sick. So, for example, in early childhood centers, what's been focused on is more the adults, and the adult mask wearing and the adult social distancing. Although even in early childhood centers, they're not really encouraging so much adults to wear masks unless they want to because of these concerns. But as I said before, there is a hierarchy of things that help to prevent COVID. The first, being hand washing and physical distancing. So, you can stress those with the mask wearing certainly being part of it in certain situations, but balancing those needs.
And in my research on technology, we actually found babies who weren't being looked at as much with the cell phone. Imagine, when my kids were little, when they were having a diaper change or, I'm nursing them, I didn't have that ability as much. And now, the babies are being handed the phone, and we know that eye contact and facial recognition is part of neurogenesis, especially for those young brains. So I tell parents to, try to maintain eye contact, even if you're wearing a mask, be expressive, use your voice, use massage, use your hands. And really all of that is very helpful for that brain growth as well.
All right, there's so many good questions right now. I don't see the question now, but the question was, how do we recognize when our child is struggling with mental health issues at this time?
Well, I guess I don't know, I'm the psychiatrist. I don't know if anyone else sees patients, but I would really say parents, you know your child. And if you think they're struggling, there's probably a good chance they are. By and large, we under-recognize mental health issues, whether it's in the classroom or the homes or even in our healthcare system. So some classic signs would be disturbed sleep, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or sleeping too much, reduced energy and motivation, lack of interest in things they normally love, whether it's sports, socializing, or their playtime. Of course, any symptoms of anxiety, panic attacks. Children feel a lot of anxiety, mental health issues in their bodies. They might complain of headaches or stomach aches or just being tired, school refusal. And really, of course, suicidal thoughts. I think that's worth asking, particularly teenagers. 1 in 4 have suicidal thoughts that, we know in general, but that doesn't mean that they're going to act on them. Increase in substance use and vaping, we're seeing rise in that attached to mental health issues. And of course, technology. We know that there is a relationship with children who have anxiety, depression, ADHD, or other mental health are more likely to self-medicate or distract themselves online and use tech to kind of get those little hits of dopamine at the expense of those healthy habits of real life connection and creativity and self-care. So, I can't say enough. I think we have to really be very watchful of our young people right now. It's a real time of stress for them, particularly from a mental health point of view.
And on that note, this is a question for you, Mariana, from an anonymous question. How do you recommend getting young teens off tech and outside without emotional meltdown?
Well, certainly, teens and preteens so on are quite used to screens, and there's a lot of really compelling material on screens. But one of the key ingredients that I mentioned in terms of kind of the high quality outdoor play environment is the space, right? And is it stimulating, right? So making sure that there is access to space that is interesting and stimulating for your children. And this can be a challenge for some of the older kids because, some of the traditional playgrounds are quite boring, frankly. So, thinking about the spaces that might be interesting and stimulating. And what we find is that the initial kind of meltdown is more kind of not being used to this new experience, and that with time that they get used to it, and they also get used to having freedom to be able to play in those spaces. And some people think kids need to learn how to play. They know how to play. We just have to give them the freedom to play.
This is a really interesting question and something I've been wondering a lot about, and I don't know if there's enough research to give us insights about this, but this person, Arlene, is asking any insight on the effect of screen time through FaceTime, and then I guess that can also translate to Zoom and Google Hangouts and whatnot, to connect with family members on babies and infants when visiting is not possible in person right now in some cases.
Yeah, I can talk about that because I looked into that just for my book that I just released, and we don't have a lot of data. We actually have some data in seniors that FaceTime and Skype and video conferencing was healthier, and actually they measured oxytocin levels in seniors who were using video calls as opposed to, let's say email or text messages. And I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense. Like, think about a text you might read, and then think about when someone you care about, their face pops up on the phone. We tend to get more excited and feel closer and more bonded. So I would say if we extrapolate that and look at kind of common sense and how we feel, it would be preferable. I know a lot of people during the pandemic were FaceTiming grandparents. My kids did. I think it was very important for them and the seniors to FaceTime each other, and it allowed for that healthy tech use. So I definitely would say that would be a preference to any kind of non-visual video or listening to each other tech.
And this might be a question for Lara. An anonymous person asks, my teen is doing distance education. Is she going to be left behind with her social skills, because of being left behind? Can we do any more to mitigate this?
Yeah, this is a concern that I share with the distance education model, and I'm a bit more pleased with the hybrid model that the secondary schools in Vancouver at least are using right now, where the kids are at least having some portion of their day in person for that very reason, because it's still allowing them to have those social connections. The screens are incredibly flat with distance learning. Many of them are having audio and visual off on the kids' end. And so while I acknowledge, there's important privacy issues there, and that's why that's happening, it really is a very confined environment. I think that because of that, I think it's going to be important for us to find other ways for our teens to be able to socialize in person. And it's, again, each family is going to have to find where they feel comfortable. So, my own family, unfortunately, our family is far away. So we don't have, older adults in the home, and that's a downside, but it's also an upside where we're able to, I think, be a little bit more risky, if you will, in letting my teens go out into the community and interact with friends and engage in, some of their normal sports, some of their normal activities, to try to make up for this lost social connection. But it is going to be something this generation faces, and that they will have to manage together, because it's certainly a shared experience where they're having very limited social encounters.
And this is a question I think ties into that, and a really important question. How are kids and teens affected differently in communities? So we're speaking about remote in particular, without access to good internet.
So I can speak to it a little. It's a big problem. This has been a problem in our healthcare and education system pre-COVID. So it's certainly not new. A large degree of some of the work that we do in my lab is actually in stroke recovery and rehab. And we forever have wanted to reach out to rural communities using technology. And the major barrier has been this poor ability to connect. So, I mean, those areas certainly, are at a disadvantage when all of your learning is supposed to be, conducted online. I know that there are mitigation strategies around that to try to send and receive information without those online connections, but it's quite difficult. It's very different than having even this type of interaction where we can actually see one another. And so I think as a society, that's something we have to think about and invest in as we move forward. And this may be a real wake-up call for how we can invest in those communities that will benefit us for a long time moving forward. So maybe we can deliver healthcare differently in the future. It may also be that we don't have to ask kids, for example, who are very, very remote to go to boarding school, when they get to high school, such as what happens right now on the East Coast in Nunavut and Thunder Bay, which has been an ongoing problem for those communities. Maybe that will be one of the bright spots from this pandemic.
Now, I want to ask this question and just preface it by saying, from what I understand, many of us misunderstand what compulsive disorders are, obsessive compulsive disorder, and I think there's a lot of stereotypes around that many of us who are not in science don't understand, or who don't have those disorders. But this person is asking, and I think it's an interesting question, Celine, can the hygienic rituals that we are implementing more actively now cause damage in children later on? And then they are pointing, they say, to OCD-like behaviors.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I definitely see that in my practice. I've seen young people, and it's hard to decide, is this OCD? Is this good hand hygiene? And again, so the criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder is that the obsessions, let's say, they have to be intrusive, meaning that, let's say the child is in the middle of a class and they have this intrusive thought that they have to go wash their hands. So it's really intruding into their mind and disrupting their focus. It has to be distressing. They actually don't like it. It's too much and excessive. So it's taking time away from, again, other important activities. Now, this is a bit grayer with the pandemic because we want people to be like, oh, did I use hand sanitizer? Did I wash my hands? And we want a little bit of distress because that's that positive stress that leads us to act. But I think really asking those questions, I ask my patients, do you ever think it's too much yourself? Do you wish you had relief from all these thoughts of hand washing and hand hygiene? Can you get a break from it? And I think some of those questions will help determine if it is OCD. And also OCD is common. Again, it's a mental health condition. We see little kids can manifest it in different ways, and definitely hygiene is one of them.
All right. A question, and I think, Lara, you kind of went into this a bit or a lot, but about this person is asking, what are the long-term effects of the pandemic on children?
Yeah, so we don't know. Let me just preface it with that. We will know in 5 and 10 years. A concern, though, in understanding how we're learning is that this persistent stress is going to make it hard for those kids to learn. It's going to be blocking the reorganization that has to take place in the brain in order for learning to occur. One of the things I didn't mention a lot about was the fact that we understand that a key factor in making long-term memory is sleep. Don't quite understand why, but if you block sleep, and in particular a phase of sleep called the rapid eye movement sleep phase, we seriously impair the capacity to encode new information, to learn, to form long-term memories. And so if you start thinking about stress and sleep disruptions and high cortisol, and you kind of let that go on and on, you're going to have a situation where kids just are really having trouble learning. So this is my primary concern around the pandemic from a learning standpoint. And that's why I really want to reinforce that is not an outcome that's set in stone. We do know that learning and experience dependent plasticity in the brain are highly dependent on our behaviors. And so I think it's really important to think about what healthy behaviors we can engage in to mitigate those effects. And I listed a few today in my talk. There are others, but the 3 that I listed today are really the most powerful. And what's great about them is they're easily accessible. They're not expensive. They don't require a drug. We can get out, we can exercise. There are mindful apps, and there are programs online. You can easily find a yoga class online that you can do from home. And then sleep and good sleep hygiene is, a source of a lot of conversation, and should be enhanced when we can. So I want to encourage everyone to take on those behaviors that we know will help to mitigate the potential long-term effects of the pandemic.
And this is a question for Dr. Brussoni. How important is interacting with other kids during outdoor play? I take my toddler to parks and playgrounds often. They're empty. What to do?
Yeah. Kids don't really want to spend much time playing without other kids. And this varies, of course. Sometimes they just want to be alone, and it varies by age. But being with other kids is quite an important part of play. So it can be challenging, and socialization of young kids with other young kids is important. So some of the things you can do, for example, is partnering up with other families. Perhaps you form a bubble with another family, or community centers are starting to start up more activities for kids that consider COVID kind of related restrictions. And as I mentioned before, there is somewhat less concern around children interacting with each other and being closer to each other around COVID, because some of the research coming out showing that they are less likely to be the transmission vectors as well as get ill during it. So I'd encourage you, if you can, to try and find some opportunities for your toddler to meet up with other toddlers.
This is a question in particular to ADHD. Again, I've lost the question, but I think this person, oh, here we go. What about kids with ADHD, specific issues regarding technology use and outdoor play, other considerations for parenting these children during the pandemic?
Sure, I can talk a bit about that. As a psychiatrist, I also have a son with ADHD who's 15, and actually just did a little TEDx on living with ADHD. And I think what I noticed with him is the online schooling was really tough. It was harder for him than my other two kids. He was constantly distracted. The fridge would distract him, the other kids would distract him, I would distract him, and he really needed all the visual cues, the environment. Even in the school, he sits close to the teacher. So I think that's one thing, is let's understand that all kids are unique. The human brain is like a fingerprint, and their needs are going to be different. And as parents, you want to proactively communicate with the teachers, resource room, whoever is in your community or pod, to advocate for what their needs might be. We know that ADHD kids are at higher risk for addiction in general, whether it's vaping, substance use, or gaming disorder, or internet addiction disorder. So we have to set limits and habits around that. Again, I can just say in our house, we shut off our Wi-Fi at 9:30. He knows that if his homework's not done, it's not done. And then there's a consequence there. We have house rules for tech in terms of no tech at the dinner table, no tech in the bedrooms, no tech in the cars. Just some simple rules that can help provide those opportunities for tech-free time. And really helping with executive functioning. So ADHD is a disorder of our executive functioning. There's trouble with task initiation, emotional regulation, strategizing, chunking. This is where tech can actually help. So we use a calendar with color-coded, green for you have a month, yellow it's due next week, red it's due tomorrow. And there's lots of good technology. There's apps. There's something called Spark Mindset, which we use for mindfulness and just emotional regulation. So understanding that part of ADHD is the planning aspect of it. And then again, I think really rely and communicate and reach out to the schools and your healthcare providers to add additional support at this time.
This is an interesting question, and I don't know if any of you guys can answer it. I've actually Googled this before and didn't get a great answer, but I mean, a lot of us are working from home. We want our kids to get outside. They might be at home as well. This person is asking, many of us think it is illegal to leave children under the age of 12 alone, so we can't send them to the playground alone. Is this true, or is this more of a gray area? I know none of you guys are versed in the law or litigation, but what is your thoughts around this?
I actually do know this.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I've looked into it, and I have a PhD student in social work, and I've talked to lawyers about this and so on.
Awesome.
So it actually varies by province. And in BC, there is no law around an acceptable age to allow your child to walk to school or be at the park or whatever. There was a case a couple of years ago, you might remember Adrian Crook and the kids on the bus that went to trial. The social workers in that case had said that the oldest child had to be at least 12 to be on the bus. It was then the decision was struck down in the sense that it was felt that social workers had overreached their capabilities of being able to make recommendations. All of that to say, long story short, there are no clear guidelines. And we want it that way because parents live in different circumstances and in different neighborhoods and have different comfort levels. And you don't, some kids are ready to walk to school at quite young ages, kindergarten even, and it's a very short walk to school or whatever. Some have to navigate much more complex environments and maybe have other health conditions that are an issue. So parents really need to be able to make these decisions for themselves. They know their kids best.
So we are running out of time, and I'm going to ask one more question from Slido before asking for your final thoughts. This is an interesting question about how does, parents' pandemic stress affect our children?
So I can comment very quickly that we know that that behaviors are contagious. So certainly our kids know when we're stressed, and that can clearly affect them. With that said, we're stressed. I mean, it's just a time that I don't think any of us ever anticipated or prepared for. Considered that our lives could change so quickly and so drastically. So I think the best part about that, at least from my work, is to be aware of it and try to role model for your children that yes, you're stressed. It's crazy, but there are things we can do about it, and we're going to do it together.
All right, well, we only have a few more minutes left. I'd like to ask all of you for a last word. As we all know, this is a challenging time with an unknown timeline. Can you each, though, provide our audience with some hopeful words? I've actually found this conversation very hopeful in general and very solution-oriented, which is fantastic. But something for our audience to keep in mind as we end, this webinar and move back into our daily routines. I'll start with Lara.
Yeah, I mean, I would just start by thanking those of you who are listening in and congratulating you, because I think the best thing we can do right now is be really informed and continue to learn and grow our boundaries and try to find solutions to mitigate the stress and the uncertainty of the time we've had and probably of the year ahead. And so just keep learning and take your kids and yourself on that voyage together of always trying to discover new information and new ways to kind of manage the environment that we're in. And
Shimi, what are your final thoughts?
I have a mantra that I picked up during my research in motivation and motivational therapy, and it says, simple is not easy, knowing is not doing, thankfully doing leads to being. And what I mean by that is the simple things: sleep, nutrition, exercise, outdoor play, habits in our home, managing tech time. These things are simple, but let's not be fooled. It's not easy. Even though we know it, that doesn't mean we're doing it. I know all this stuff. I forget myself all the time and then suffer the stress of that. But thankfully, when we get to the doing, when we actually consistently apply these habits, then we will have better health. Our brain, our bodies are hardwired towards health. So as a parent and a teacher or a practitioner, whoever you are, just really to keep track of that. Don't give up. It's really getting these habits in place. Be that dolphin. Don't be too easy. Don't be too hard. Be shoulder to shoulder. Work with people. Manage screen time. Really think about the tech diet that you're consuming yourselves and others around you. And forums like this, I think, there is a silver lining to the pandemic. I think there's lots of things that have opened up and possibly even improved in our lives. So let's see where we get on the other side. I think it'll make us stronger than ever.
All right, and final thoughts, Mariana.
Yeah, well, just, I mean, I know as a parent myself and with my focus on parents that there's so much shaming information out there that we always feel like we're doing something wrong and that something different. And I just really want parents to recognize all that they are doing for their kids and really to think about what's most important to them and try and block out kind of all of that stress around what you think other people think you should be doing and what is that you want for your child as they grow, and thinking about the opportunities you had and how you can provide some of that for your own kids.
I just want to thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. And I think, again, it's been very focused on solutions and hope and skills and strategies parents can use to help their kids grow and develop in a positive way during this pandemic. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our fabulous speakers for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And a big thank you, of course, to our audience. What an incredible list of questions. That was really excellent engagement. And my favorite part of panels always is having that audience interaction. So thank you so much for your valuable and thought-provoking question. This video from the webinar will be available in the coming days. Tell your friends who missed out on it. It will be at med.ubc.ca/giving/webinar-series. And the ULR is currently showing on the screen. As a reminder, this is the first webinar in the Transforming Health for Everyone webinar series, brought to you by the UBC Faculty of Medicine Development and Alumni Engagement. Please keep an eye out for more upcoming webinars in the future. As a world-leading research university with a deep commitment to our students, we find ourselves in a position of strength to meet the challenges brought on by the pandemic. We have responded to the situation by creating the UBC President's Pandemic Recovery Initiative, which encompasses funds to provide emergency relief for our students and accelerate advanced research. Please join others in the UBC community as we face this immense challenge head on by contributing to one of the two opportunities if you can. With your help, we will get through this together and stronger, become stronger. You can find the link to donate on support.ubc.ca. This ULR is also currently showing on your screen. We wish everyone very well in this time of uncertainty. Please be safe and behave. Be safe, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your day.